Dust hung in the air like a veil, stirred by the iron wheels of the incoming wagon. The sound of hooves on dry earth echoed across the empty main street, each beat announcing change to a town that had grown used to silence. Folks leaned against porch rails, peered out from shop windows, and stood in clusters beneath the fading sign of the general store. It wasn't often a wagon from the east rolled into this patch of the prairie, and when one did, it carried with it the promise of fresh beginnings or trouble. Everyone knew which one this visit was meant to bring. The rancher had sent for a bride. That fact alone was enough to fuel gossip over morning coffee and late suppers. He was a man known for his work, not for his words, and he'd built his spread with sweat, grit, and stubbornness. What he lacked was company at his table, laughter in his halls, and a steady hand to soften the rough edges of his days. The women of the town whispered of his decision with curiosity, some with envy, and a few with disapproval. But no one dared say a thing to his face. Men like him weren't questioned. They were endured. The wagon creaked to a halt in front of the boarding house, its canvas cover frayed and marked by long miles. The driver climbed down with the weariness of someone who had crossed too many dust roads and rivers. Then, before the curious eyes of the townsfolk, the canvas shifted. A hand, pale yet deliberate, pushed back the flap. The crowd hushed, children leaning forward on tiptoes, waiting to see the bride who'd been spoken of for weeks. But when she stepped down, there was a ripple through the gathering, a ripple that quickly became a wave. She was not the plain, hopeful farm girl many had imagined. She was no timid soul sent west with dreams of security. No, this woman carried herself with a kind of boldness that turned necks and froze conversation. Her dress, though dulled by dust, clung with an elegance that had no place in a settlement like this. Her hair gleamed under the late sun, pinned with care despite the long journey. And her smile, or perhaps it was a smirk, suggested she knew precisely the kind of entrance she was making. Murmurs spread. Some recognized her face, though few dared admit it aloud. She wasn't just any woman. She had a name carried in whispers, in stories men didn't share where wives could hear. She had been a presence in the kind of establishments that thrived on dim lantern light and laughter too loud to be innocent. She was known, even celebrated, in cities far east of here, not for virtue but for allure. That such a woman would step from a wagon in their God-fearing village left the crowd stunned, jaws tight and eyes narrowing. The rancher stood at the edge of the boardwalk, broad shoulders squared, hands gripping his hat as though it might anchor him against what he was seeing. He had ordered a bride, sent money and trust into the unknown, expecting a woman of quiet strength and gentle spirit. Instead, he was staring at someone the whole town would call infamous. The questions lit up his mind like sparks in dry grass. Was this some cruel mistake? Or had someone somewhere played a trick on him? The woman's gaze found him easily, as if she had already memorized his stance from rumor alone. She walked toward him without hesitation, each step measured, her eyes unflinching. Whatever weight she carried from her past, she wore it not with shame but with a daring sort of pride. If she noticed the stares, the whispers, or the judgment that followed her every movement, she gave no sign that the silence stretched, the kind that makes time itself feel longer. The townsfolk waited, breath held, to see what would happen when the two stood face to face. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the earth itself had paused until the woman spoke. Her voice was warm but edged like honey laced with smoke. "Well?" she said, almost playfully, "I hear you've been waiting on me." The rancher's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her. His mind fought for words, but none came fast enough. Around them, the town bristled with tension. Some smirked in anticipation of scandal. Others watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. knowing this moment would be remembered for years. The wagon driver spat into the dust and muttered something only half heard about a mix-up at the agency or a switch along the road. But the details no longer mattered. What mattered was the undeniable truth standing in front of everyone. The rancher had ordered a bride, and instead, a woman with a reputation too large for this small place had walked off the wagon. She tilted her head, studying the man who had unknowingly summoned her into his world. There was no shame in her eyes, only something else, something unreadable, like a secret waiting to be told. He, on the other hand, stood torn between anger and disbelief, trapped in a moment he hadn't chosen yet couldn't escape. The sun dipped lower, painting the street in gold and shadow. The air was thick, expectant, heavy with what might follow. No one dared move, as though any step might set the fragile scene to break apart. The rancher finally parted his lips to speak, but the words caught, uncertain. And before he could decide whether to send her away or demand an explanation, she leaned closer. Her whisper meant for him alone. "You don't know why I'm here, do you?" His eyes darkened, his silence louder than any answer. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for what would happen next, but the woman only smiled, a smile that promised complication, promised change, promised stories no one in that town could yet imagine. And as the sky turned from gold to crimson, the future of the rancher, the town, and the woman who had stepped off the wagon hung in the balance, waiting for the first move that would unravel everything. The sun dipped lower behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the town as the woman stood there with her sly smile, her presence filling the silence like thunder that had not yet broken. The rancher's hat stayed clenched in his hand, his knuckles pale against the worn brim, and though his stance was firm, something in his eyes betrayed the storm that had risen inside him. He had braced himself for a life changed by companionship, for the quiet arrival of a bride who would help turn his lonely ranch into a home. But this was something else entirely. The townsfolk began to stir, murmurs rushing through the crowd like wind in dry grass. Some women crossed their arms, lips pressed tight, already writing judgments that would pass from kitchen to kitchen. The men shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying a strange mix of curiosity and unease. They had heard of her, or at least heard stories tales traded on cold nights in saloons of a woman whose fame stretched across more than one frontier town. Those stories had been spoken like campfire legends, half in awe, half in shame. And now she was here, standing on their very street, called by fate or mistake into their lives. The rancher wanted to demand answers, but words would not form. Instead, he turned sharply and motioned for her to follow. Without waiting for permission, she stepped beside him, her boots light on the wooden walk. Together they crossed the silent street, leaving the watching eyes to boil in their questions. The sound of the boarding house door opening and closing behind them was the last note in a song that left the town restless, already buzzing with talk. Inside the dim-lit room, the rancher faced her, his broad frame tense, his voice finally steady enough to break the heavy quiet. "Who sent you?" he asked. Her lips curved again, though softer this time, her eyes carrying that strange mix of daring and secrecy. She didn't answer at once, as though savoring the weight of the question, as though the truth, whatever it was, could wait a moment longer. Instead, she stepped past him, trailing her fingers along the edge of the wooden table. "Does it matter?" she said lightly. "I'm here now." The rancher's jaw set hard. "It matters." Her gaze flicked back to him, sharp and knowing. "You thought you were sending for a bride? A woman who'd sew curtains, bake bread, and nod politely when you spoke. But maybe what you really needed was something else. Maybe what came to you is exactly what was meant." He took a step toward her, the floor creaking under his boots. "I don't need games. I need to know who you are and why you came here under the promise of marriage." Her eyes softened, though not with shame. "You already know who I am, even if you don't want to admit it." His silence was answer enough. He had heard the stories too. Perhaps he had never expected them to take shape in flesh before him. But now there she stood, no rumor, no distant tale, but a living, breathing woman whose past could not be erased. The moment stretched until the boarding-house keeper bustled in, her face flustered with curiosity poorly hidden beneath a thin veil of courtesy. She set down a pitcher of water with a sharp clatter, her eyes darting between the two. The woman merely smiled at her, calm as ever, while the rancher gave a curt nod. When the keeper left, closing the door a little too slowly, it was clear. Word would spread faster than fire and dry timber. By morning, every soul within a day's ride would know the rancher's bride was not the one he ordered. The woman poured herself a glass of water, sipping with elegance that seemed strange in such a plain room. Her hands were steady, but her eyes revealed a glimmer of weariness, as though the long road had cost her more than she cared to admit. She did not speak of it, and he did not ask, though the question lingered unspoken. What roads had she taken? To end here? What bargain or twist of fate had placed her in his path? As darkness settled outside, lamps flickered across the town, and the saloon piano started its nightly tune. Laughter rose, boots scuffed against sawdust floors, but the boarding-house held its own hush. The rancher stayed near the window, staring at the lantern-lit street, the weight of the day pressing heavy on him. Behind him, she stretched out her weary limbs, yet her posture never lost its grace. He thought of the money he had sent, the letters exchanged, the agency that had promised a match. Somewhere along that chain, truth had slipped, twisted, or been stolen outright. He wanted to ride east tomorrow and demand justice, but he knew such a thing would change nothing. What stood before him was not a letter or a mistake on paper. It was a woman, flesh and bone, eyes sharp and haunting, whose presence had already shaken his world. He finally turned to face her. "This can't stand, you know it." Her smile faded, replaced by something steadier. "You think I haven't heard that before?" She asked quietly. "You think men haven't told me where I don't belong, what I can't be. Yet somehow, I'm still standing, and now here, in your town, in your story." The way she said it sent a shiver through him, though he didn't show it. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was simply stating a fact, as if her presence was a force of nature, as inevitable as a storm rolling down from the hills. Night deepened, and the town outside settled into its rhythm of music, drink, and hushed conversation. But inside, the tension between them held fast, thick as rope. Neither seemed willing to yield, and neither fully revealed what they carried inside. The rancher's thoughts spun with conflict, while the woman's secrets glimmered just out of reach. In the quiet hours that followed, the boarding-house walls kept their secrets, though the town outside would not. Already men at the saloon whispered. Women at their stoves pressed for details, and children, wide-eyed, repeated what they had overheard. The rancher's bride was not a bride at all, but someone famous, someone whose reputation had arrived long before her wagon did. Yet in that small room, with shadows stretching long across the floor, the story was only just beginning. She watched him as if daring him to decide, daring him to cast her out or claim her. He, in turn, struggled with a choice he had never imagined. The night ended without answers, only questions. And when dawn threatened the horizon, the suspense still hung thick, ready to break in ways neither of them could yet see. And as the first pale light crept across the prairie, painting the town in silver gray, one truth became clear. Whatever path had brought her here was not finished. The rancher had thought he'd ordered a bride, simple and certain. But what he had received was something far more complicated, something that would test not only his will, but the soul of the whole town. The morning sun rose slow and steady over the prairie, spilling pale gold light across the rooftops of the town. Roosters crowed, wagons rattled over uneven boards, and the first clangs of a blacksmith's hammer rang out. Yet beneath the surface of that ordinary start, the town was unsettled. Whispers from the night before had grown restless wings, flying from porch to porch and spilling out of shop doors. By breakfast, every man and woman in town had heard the story. The rancher's bride had stepped off the wagon, and she wasn't the bride anyone had expected. At the boarding house, she stirred awake in a narrow bed, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling. Her body carried the weight of travel, yet her mind stayed alert, restless. She knew towns like this, one quiet, orderly, ruled as much by gossip as by law. She could feel the judgment in every glance, even when the eyes were not on her. Still, she dressed with deliberate care, brushing out her dark hair, smoothing her dress, and setting her shoulders before she walked into the dining room. Every spoon paused mid-air as she entered. Conversation stopped. The keeper gave her a stiff smile, setting down a plate with more force than necessary. She only thanked her softly, sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall, a position she had chosen many times before. She ate in silence, though she could feel the town measuring her with every stolen glance. The rancher did not come to breakfast. He had risen before dawn and was already out riding the fence lines, letting the wind cool his heated thoughts. The rhythm of his horse beneath him was steady, but his mind was anything but. He replayed the moment of her arrival again and again, searching for meaning where there was none. He had asked for a bride, for a partner to share his life, not for someone with a past as loud as hers. He wondered if he had been tricked, if some hand at the agency had seen fit to make a mockery of him. But when he thought of the way she looked at him, unflinching, almost challenging, he knew this was no simple mistake. Meanwhile, in town, the saloon was alive earlier than usual. Men gathered, cups of coffee traded for mugs of whiskey as they leaned in close to discuss what this twist meant. Some laughed, finding entertainment in the rancher's humiliation. Others shook their heads, muttering about the danger of such a woman in their midst. A few, though, spoke with a glint of interest, wondering what might come of her presence and what stories she might bring with her. By midday, a second conflict had already begun to stir. The preacher, a man with a sharp voice and sterner eyes, declared from his pulpit that sin had set foot in their midst. He urged the townsfolk to guard their children, to protect their homes, to ensure that the place they had built on sweat and prayer would not be poisoned by temptation. His words struck a chord with many, and soon a line had begun to form, separating those who saw her as a threat from those who dared to see her as something more complicated. The rancher returned from the plains that evening, his shirt streaked with dust, his face shadowed by weariness. He had hoped to find peace in the open air, but the moment he rode back into town, he felt the weight of 100 eyes. He tied his horse, walked through the whispers, and pushed open the boarding house door. She was waiting there, sitting by the lamp, her gaze steady as if she had known exactly when he would arrive. "You ran," she said softly, not unkind. "I worked," he replied, voice gruff. "That's what I do." "And you think work will make me vanish?" His jaw tightened. "I think it'll keep me sane until I figure out what to do with you." She rose, her presence filling the room. "Do with me? You make it sound as though I'm some problem to be solved." "Maybe I'm here to solve you." He turned away, but her words clung to him like burrs. He wanted to believe she was nothing more than trouble, yet there was something about the certainty in her voice that shook him. Outside, the tension grew thicker. The storekeeper's wife whispered that the rancher had been cursed, that this woman would ruin his name. The blacksmith, however, muttered that a man had the right to decide for himself what sort of company he kept. Children, catching snatches. of both sides ran about with wide eyes, repeating scraps of overheard conversation. The town had become a place divided by one arrival, its quiet rhythm disrupted. Late that night, when the town had fallen back into uneasy rest, the saloon keeper found himself staring out the window, pipe smoke curling around him. He had seen her before, years back in another place, where her laughter had filled a smoky room and men had vied for her attention. He remembered the way she had carried herself then, not like a woman trapped, but like one who chose her path, no matter how narrow. He knew she was more than what the whispers said. And yet, even he wondered what she wanted here, stepping straight into a life promised to another. Back at the ranch, the rancher's foreman worried. If the town turned its back on their employer, trade would falter, help would dry up, and the ranch itself could suffer. Cattle didn't care about rumors, but men did, and men were needed to keep the work going. The foreman debated whether to confront his boss, but something in his gut warned him this was a matter that went beyond cattle and fences. This was about pride, trust, and the fragile thread of reputation. And so, the days unfolded, each one thick with questions that had no answers. The woman remained calm, unshaken by glares, speaking little but moving with purpose. The rancher grew quieter, his usual bluntness buried under the weight of indecision. The town grew louder, its every corner filled with speculation, every glance sharpened by fear, curiosity, or desire. The true conflict was no longer just between the rancher and the woman who had arrived in his stead. It was spreading outward, touching the lives of everyone around them. Some wanted her gone, sent back east on the first wagon. Some wanted to see what storm she might bring. And others, though they dared not admit it aloud, felt a strange pull toward her, as though she carried with her a kind of freedom that they themselves had long forgotten. But the woman did not yet tell her story. She did not reveal why she had come, nor why fate had tied her path to the ranchers. She let the questions hang, let the tension grow, as though waiting for the right moment to turn everything on its head. And as the prairie winds carried the smell of dust and sage through the town, the sense of something coming, something larger than one mistake, larger than one woman's past, settled over them all like a storm brewing on the horizon. No one knew how it would break, only that when it did, nothing in that quiet American village of the late 1800s would ever be the same again. The days bled one into another, each sunrise casting the same uneasy light over the town, each sunset sinking with more weight than the last. The woman's presence had shifted from rumor to fact, yet the whispers hadn't faded. They had only grown sharper. The people no longer asked if she was staying. They asked how long it would take before the rancher sent her away. But she stayed, calm as ever, moving through the streets with her head held high, as if daring anyone to push her out. Children stared, men lowered their voices when she passed, and the women tightened their shawls around their shoulders as if to guard themselves from something unseen. The rancher kept to his land during daylight, riding fence lines, hauling feed, and throwing himself into work with the desperation of a man who feared stillness. But every evening, as dusk pulled its cloak over the plains, he found himself drawn back to the boarding house. He told himself it was to keep order, to ensure she wasn't spreading more trouble. Yet deep inside, he knew it was because her presence weighed on him more heavily when she was out of sight. He wanted to resist it, to push her away, but he could not ignore the way her eyes seemed to see more of him than anyone else ever had. Tension grew louder in town. The preacher thundered from his pulpit with more fire each Sunday, calling her a test of their faith, a serpent sent to tempt good men. His sermon stirred fear, and fear bred anger. A few townsfolk muttered about taking matters into their own hands if the rancher refused to. Others urged caution, worried that one wrong move would tear the fragile fabric of their community apart. The saloon, meanwhile, thrived on the stir. Men who never cared for church pews leaned closer over their whiskey, sharing guesses about what she was planning, who she had been, and why she'd been sent here. Some said she was running from something bigger than herself. Others swore she carried secrets that could ruin more than just the rancher's name. One night, the rancher found her waiting for him outside the boarding house. The street was quiet, save for the echo of a piano from the saloon and the bark of a dog somewhere in the distance. She leaned against the railing, her silhouette framed by the lantern glow. "You've stopped asking me questions," she said, her voice soft but edged. "Maybe I don't want the answers," he muttered. She studied him, her expression unreadable. "Or maybe you're afraid of what you'll do with them." He looked away, jaw tight, but she stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath her boots. "This town thinks they know me," she whispered. "They think my story is written in smoke and shadows. But you," she paused, her breath catching faintly before she steadied it, "you haven't decided what to believe yet. That's why you're different." He met her eyes, searching them for something honest, something he could hold on to. But what he saw only deepened the storm inside him. She carried truth like a blade, hidden, dangerous, sharp enough to cut him if he reached for it. The following day, conflict broke the surface. A group of men gathered outside the general store, voices rising until the sheriff had to step between them. They demanded she be sent away, claiming the town's children should not grow up under her shadow. The sheriff, though firm, warned them against rash action. Yet the anger did not fade. It only simmered, waiting for the right spark. That spark came sooner than expected. Late one evening, as the woman walked back from the well with a bucket in her hands, a stone clattered at her feet. She froze, eyes lifting to see three young men standing at the edge of the street, their faces twisted with boldness that came from drink. "Town's no place for the likes of you," one sneered. She straightened, her grip steady on the handle of the bucket. "Go home," she said simply. The second one laughed, bitter and sharp. "Or what? You'll smile us to death?" The moment stretched, the tension humming in the air, until the rancher's voice cut through the night. "Enough." He stepped from the shadows, his frame filling the street, his tone cold enough to silence them. The young men shifted under his stare, muttered something half-hearted, and finally retreated, their footsteps quick and uneven. The woman's eyes followed them until they were gone, then flicked back to him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied. His voice was firm, but inside, he knew what he had just done. He had placed himself between her and the town. And once a man drew such a line, there was no stepping back. Word spread faster than wildfire. By morning, everyone knew the rancher had defended her. To some, it was proof he had fallen under her spell. To others, it was a sign of weakness, a crack in his armor. The preacher spoke louder than ever, urging men to guard their homes, women to guard their hearts, and the community to guard its very soul. The saloon keeper, watching the storm build, began to wonder if blood would be spilled before long. He had seen how men's fear could turn to violence, and he knew the preacher's words were pouring oil on already burning coals. The woman, however, did not falter. She walked through the town with the same steady stride, her chin lifted, her eyes clear. If the whispers stung, she never showed it. Yet late at night, when the rancher caught her alone by the lamplight, he could see the weariness in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one was watching. She was strong, but she was human, and the weight of being hunted by whispers was a heavy one. The rancher began to feel the pull of two worlds. One demanded he cast her out, keep his name clean, and hold on to the respect he had earned. The other tugged at something deeper, something unspoken, urging him to see her not as the town painted her, but as she truly was. Yet he did not know what she truly was. only that she carried secrets that could change everything. As the days shortened and the nights grew colder, the sense of looming conflict pressed down on the town like a storm that refused to break. Every corner seemed to buzz with expectation, every face turned sharper, every word laced with warning. The rancher's foreman warned him plainly that trouble was coming. The sheriff tightened his watch, knowing one wrong move could tip the fragile balance. And the preacher gathered his flock with greater urgency, his sermons now carrying an edge of fire that spoke of cleansing and righteousness. It was clear to everyone that a moment was coming, a moment when choices would be made, when silence would no longer be enough, when the truth she carried would have to step into the light. The woman knew it too. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken around her, in the restless glances of the townsfolk, in the way the rancher's eyes grew darker with questions he dared not speak. She was no stranger to storms, but this one was different. This was not a storm of fists or words whispered behind closed doors. This was a storm that could break lives, scatter trust, and leave nothing but ashes in its wake. One evening, as the town quieted beneath a cold wind, she stood alone at the edge of the street, watching the church bell tower cut against the fading sky. The rancher found her there, silent beside her, both of them staring at the horizon as though waiting for it to split open. "They'll come," she said at last. "One way or another, they'll come." He didn't deny it. He only stood there. The tension between them stretched tight as wire. And in that silence, the town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the clash that everyone knew was coming, waiting for the moment when the fragile threads would snap and the truth would strike like lightning.